interface between the blade and the puck such that it goes exactly where you want it. The skill within basketball will be after you do a respective offensive move, right? Like a drill, a drop set, a spin, a two-step attack, and then you put up your shot. That's your skill. Throwing a baseball is you generate all this amazing force within the wind-up, right, and the gather to release it, but the skill is where you place that. All these fine-tuned things that get released, and then the deceleration thereafter. So many of our injuries happen in the deceleration. A lot of our time is spent in that skill component, but we have to have that whole entire component. That's what motor learning is. That's what impulse is. That's where we almost need to start thinking about, is how do we actually make this whole continuum a whole lot better for our athletes. Question 3 is so we talked about how we identify talent. Now we've gone through what should we be doing to be able to develop our talent. And then the big thing is talent is almost useless if we become injured. Doesn't do anyone good if you become injured. So we'll quickly go over signs and symptoms and injuries. Injuries are really just exposures to loads and forces that exceed our tissue tolerance. So imagine if you had this building here and a hurricane came through. Is this building hurricane rated? Right? I don't know. Hope so. Because all of our stuff's in here, but maybe, let's say for example it's not. So that hurricane exceeded the building properties. It wasn't designed to be able to handle a hurricane. So we have to be able to design our bodies to be able to handle all the loads that we're faced with. I'm going to skip this. Right? So, movement is a funny thing, because if we pay attention to our bodies really well, right, potentially we can prevent a lot of injuries. Because, let's see this, a sign, right, is something that we can see, that we may think, right, like that we can actually measure, that we may think that can become a problem. A symptom is actually something that you feel. So let's say, for example, you have knee pain. You, yourself, like this, like a symptom is something that you feel. Like you have knee pain, right? That's a symptom. A sign would be, maybe there's swelling. I can see, I can measure something, that there's swelling around that area, right? So, for injuries, the relationship between our signs and our symptoms is very important about how we prevent injuries. So, let me just go through here. So let's say this is when a symptom occurs, right through here. Do you guys believe that our signs come before or after your symptoms? Let's look at it. Before. So what are some of our most important signs? Movement dysfunctions. So imagine if a kid is blowing their knee inwards. Imagine if a kid is kind of running and their feet are doing crazy things and they can't even control their bodies within space. Over 90% of 3,000 athletes tested display inward movement of the knee to some degree. And that's known to be related to non-contact ACL ruptures, meniscal problems, low back problems. So the sign came way before a person became symptomatic. Yet, where do we do all of our interventions? When do we actually start caring about doing something? It's after the symptom. After they start feeling pain. That's when rehab takes place. That's when suddenly we realize that, hey, we got to do something about this because we have to, because they're feeling pain. But the signs came way before that. We could have intervened through a whole bunch of time, years, before things really become symptomatic. So, the real question is, when did the injury happen? When are you becoming injured? When are your athletes starting to become injured? For example, you have tendinopathy, jumper's knee. What do? You rest. You don't build any qualities, you don't do anything like that. You think that rest is going to resolve things, but what happens is, during that rest period, your muscles become weaker, you become less strong, You can't control your knee nearly as well, so you actually become in a worse state. You return back, you're weaker, then you try to do your respective sport. First day, hey, wow, I'm feeling a lot better, I can play one practice. But then you accumulate strain again, and then you're back in a worse scenario than you were before. And then you do this, it gets chronic over time, over years, leads to big problems. The load exposure, you know, it's not just 1 + 1, it really aggregates, it's exponential. It's like 1 + 1 = 3. Here's a quick video of you know, some of the dynamic valgus that we would have seen with their athletes. And so that's a senior women's national team member. That's, you know, a young developing athlete, so you can just see their knees collapsing inwards. And here's a young kid jumping up, landing. And so the real big question is, what are they ready for? We've done the research and we've looked at it, you know, 3,000 athletes, 90% end up looking like this, right? Like, not quite to this degree, but their knees move inwards. So what's happening is, here's our sign. This is our sign. They're not symptomatic yet. They haven't experienced pain quite yet. So we gotta do something to do that, to address that. Jumper's knee, one of the really most common things that's a byproduct of poor knee control. And when we look at it, we look at a whole bunch of factors that determine the loads. So if you're thinking about your knee moving inwards, do you think the loads on the knees are greater or less than if you were to move straight up and down? Sorry, less? Greater? Hopefully it's obvious. Like if you were to stand up and start cranking on your knee repeatedly, you start running and then do miles upon miles where you're running with your knees inwards, yeah, you'd probably think that, yeah, you'd be pretty likely to develop a problem, an injury over time. If you did it long enough, I almost guarantee that you're going to develop a problem. Most musculoskeletal injuries are movement dysfunctions. Probably 90% plus are the ways in which we move. So if we're not moving very well, and then we're going to practices, we're going through games, going through scrimmages, we don't really care what's going on, all of a sudden we're putting a whole bunch of stress through our respective tendon, and all of a sudden you take a nice normal tendon and you go through this pathology. Right? So you can see those little dots, I hope. Those are tendon cells. When they become sensitized, all of a sudden there's thousands of those tendon sites because they're being sensitized. Then if it's prolonged enough, all of a sudden you see the regular, nice organization of the tendon. You don't have nice organization of the tendon. It actually becomes degraded. So you actually have histological or cellular changes that are actually going on. Your athletes, when they start experiencing tendinopathy, are going down this path. These are the major factors that we're considering. Right? Motor control. How well do they control their bodies? Do they have that sensory integration of their body to be able to understand where they are within space? And then can they control it? That's that biomechanical control. Then we have all these temporal factors that looks at their games or practices or tournaments. You know, parents, whether or not they understand this. Coaches, whether they push the athletes to continue even though their knees are bothering them. Whether or not the system is designed in a way that permits for rest and recovery. Right? That permits an athlete to say, you know what, I shouldn't be playing today because I'm actually starting to break down. We took a viewpoint where we went forward in time, where we looked at, hey, how this happens over time. But we could easily go backwards. So we have a pro athlete. And why did they become injured? We have Mario Lemieux over here, and he had his career cut short because of a low back problem. He was over here within that graph, right? Where the loads and exposures and his symptoms were way above that threshold. He was injured. But college and university and through his pro career set the stage for what happened in him as a pro. High school set that stage, but really, When was he becoming injured? Really, when did this whole process really begin? You take it all the way back to grassroots, to your movement quality. So hopefully it becomes really obvious that, hey, these movement qualities need to be corrected, otherwise they'll stay with you for the rest of your life, and they have huge implications. And that's movement. So hopefully you just take that with you. Our approach is that we understand injuries, we understand performance, we focus in on that brain, and this is our secret method to develop and how we build better athletes. Our approach is based on principle, our practice supports that, where all we care about is movement qualities. We look at how an athlete develops force, and then we think about the contextual factors. Those are our respective principles. And so what do we do in practice? We take them into our lab, we look at actually how they move, how they squat, how they do a single leg squat, how they lunge. Do they do the basic well? If they don't do basic well, we teach them how to do basic well. Then we look at how they produce force, right? And then we compare how they produce force, how their movement qualities are against other kids their age, against other kids in their competition level, right? And also with a distant roadmap of where do they want to get to, right? We do all of those types of things to be able to figure out a roadmap so that we can figure out how to get them there. And then we execute on our respective plan, and then we monitor to make sure that we're actually on that right roadmap. And again, everything is done through motor learning, movement development. And so Corey's going to go through some top 10 things that you guys can kind of consider in developing your young athletes.
These are top 10 principles of athletic development. So the first one, very simple, do no harm. Right? It's easy to kind of come in and say, wow, I want that 35-inch vert, 40-inch vert. But if we already know that quality of movement is the most important thing, we don't want to pile on all this strength and force into a body that isn't built to handle. So do no harm, always build properly. Future success is built on a foundation. So again, we have to develop that quality movement if we want to hope to get an actual expert level performance later. If we try to get a body to do this 40-inch vertical or this 9.6 100-meter dash, and we know that it's not built to handle that, it'll never happen. So you have to do the foundational things first to set the stage to be able to do amazing things later. Long-term athlete development. We talked about that road and being on the right path and it looking off into the future. Right? Understand that most of the kids that we are working with, that you're working with, their expertise will come in 8 years or 10 years, right? It's not when you're 15 and you're going to that next tournament. It's really when you're playing at the university level or the national team level, or maybe if you're lucky, the professional level. So don't think about next week and that next team that you're going to try out for next month, but say, are we looking at things from a long-term perspective to do it properly? Signs, symptoms, and injuries, right? There are things that we can see that are going to tell us whether someone is prone. I can almost guarantee you that Vince Carter, right, one of the most explosive athletes that we've seen in the last decade, now he can barely jump, right? If you watch him play in the NBA, his game is completely different than when he was with the Raptors, right? He has so much problems with his tendon, and you could say, I bet you if we watched him play in North Carolina, watch him do all these activities in the gym, in practice, there are signs. I can guarantee you there are signs, and unfortunately they didn't get looked at the appropriate way. Movement and sport diversity. When you're looking for an athlete who's creative, who is robust, like we said in our definition of athleticism, you can't get stuck in just doing the same sport all the time, right? When you're young, don't specialize too much. Play different sports. Play different activities. Just go out and play, right? The more diversity you get exposed to, the more creative they're actually being in the sport. You can't predict the future. We're talking about talent identification. It's easy to say, wow, guys with long arms are going to have an advantage in basketball. Or this kid is jumping 21 inches and they're 12. That means they're going to jump 40 when they're 20. Doesn't necessarily happen that way. Follow the steps, right? Go through the regular path. Don't say, my kid is definitely going to be a 100-meter sprinter. Maybe your kid doesn't want to sprint. You may not know best. We have parents that come in all the time and say, okay, here's my kid. I want you to work with him because I hear you guys are amazing. But this is what I want. I want my kid to have 5 inches on his vertical. Well, we look at the kid's movement. We look at how they do things and we say, that may not be what is best for your athlete right now, right? We have to look long term. We look at foundation, signs and symptoms, right? All these principles, and you say, maybe the 5 inches right now isn't the most important thing. So as a parent and coach, you have to look at and say, what is the most important thing right now? No yo-yo. That was the concept of that consistent training approach throughout a whole year, throughout multiple years. Not going up, coming back down, just getting those same results back every 3 or 6 months, but building. Build a growth mindset. This is something that Thomas didn't really touch on, but is actually extremely important. So the same way that motor learning and having certain challenging environments is amazing for skill development, but you also have to be able to foster a certain mindset to appreciate that challenge, right? A growth mindset is someone who sees a challenge as a way to improve and a way to get better and uses that and helps keep going forward. Someone with a fixed mindset might say, that's too hard. I can't do that.